Hi, everybody. Welcome to Conversation with Calvin, We the Species. I'm speaking fast here because we have a lot to do. I'm thrilled because we have Laura Chavez-Moreno, Dr. Laura Chavez-Moreno, with us to talk about how schools make race, her newest book. We're going to talk about all of that real quickly. She's an award-winning researcher, social scientist, assistant professor, at actually one of my favorite schools. I've been a UCLA fan for a long, long time. Assistant professor at UCLA on the Departments of Chicana, Central American Studies and Education. She's got her master's degree, I'm sorry, PhD degree from the University of Wisconsin, another Big Ten school. So we have a lot to talk about. I'm done with my monologue. Laura, why don't you do a little brief intro, and we're going to then jump in to this. Okay, take it away.
Thank you, Calvin. I'm really excited to chat with you about the book. And like you said, I'm at UCLA now as a professor. Before that, and before my graduate studies, I was a teacher. I taught in Philadelphia. I taught Spanish in two different high schools. I grew up in Arizona. I went to undergrad in Northern Arizona University. I studied how to teach Spanish, so education and the Spanish language. I studied Latin American Studies was my minor, and I grew up in Douglas, Arizona, and Agua Prieta, Sonora, Mexico. So I went back and forth between the two cities.
Perfect. But I'm a big Sedona fan. I've been there 12 times.
Oh yeah, Sedona's lovely.
Climbing the mountains. Okay, so what inspired you to write How Schools Make Race?
Thank you. One of the things that I was interested in exploring was about how teachers understood how to teach about race. And I didn't really initially start thinking about the book from when I was started, excuse me, I didn't start the study and thinking about the book in the way that it is now. So I first started collecting data thinking of a different kind of question in terms of like how this bilingual education program that I was studying served its Latinx students and improved their education
Okay,
or or didn't perhaps.
okay,
So that's how what I started the study thinking about. In the end, because of national conversations, because of things that I heard in the classroom, it kind of changed my focus changed a little bit. But my interest in it was really because of my own experience, both as a student and also as a teacher, and grappling with questions about race.
okay. Which, what does it mean when you say schools make race?
Oh, thanks so much for the question because I think that it's really important for us to also just talk about the main point of the book. And what I mean by schools make race, that means that schools teach about racial ideas. They do that directly. For example, a teacher could share like this is race versus ethnicity, which is actually a lesson that I saw in the bilingual program. But most of the times, schools teach about race and racial ideas indirectly. So I can share some examples. So for example, when a program like the bilingual education program teaches about, for example, histories, whose histories matters, for example, that teaches implicitly about racial ideas, right? Which ones are worth studying, which ones are not. But another way that the book really explores and that sometimes is not really understood just in the pop in like general conversations about race is that schools in providing different resources to certain types of students or certain groups of students versus others. And when I mean type of resources, for example, that means tracking some students and then providing them different curriculum that's not as rigorous, for example, in giving them a substandard curriculum or worse instruction, etc., that then produces the outcomes that would be, for example, worse than other groups who received a better curriculum, right? So those different treatments, that different type of providing the resources, makes sense that it produces these different outcomes in the students groups, right? And then we as a society, we see those different patterns and we then map onto racial meanings to it. What I mean by that is that we see those patterns and then we see that they are racial, that the differences are racial, and then we attribute to that to racial ideas in terms of which group is inferior and which group is better or smarter, etc.
Okay, okay. Um, how do schools contribute to the racialization of Latinx, and you can also explain that term so people understand Latinx. Uh, Latinx students, even without necessarily like mentioning race. Um,
Yeah. So when I use the word Latinx, I use it because I want to challenge patriarchy and the gender binary that the word Latino in Spanish, for example, has, where words that end in O have a masculine connotation. So I use it to challenge that patriarchy and gender binaries. But then I also use it as a reminder that this is a word that's different from Latin American. Those are two different types of groups, categories, concepts. And I also use I use the X to problematize the Latin in the word because the Latin was imposed by European elites in order to name this continent or a group of people. So I use the X as a reminder for those two things specifically also.
yeah. Okay. Um, in what ways do teachers in schools practices unintentionally reinforce racial hierarchies? They don't mean to do it, but they do it.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I find also, and a lot of other researchers also find this. Obviously, teachers and other educators don't go into education wanting to produce the same type of racial patterns in our society, right? The thing is that a lot of the times the structures in society in our schools are really difficult to change, and people accept them as the way that schooling should be. What I mean by that is, for example, it's already accepted that students should be given standardized tests in order to see whether they're learning a material or not, and then compare them across the nation, for example. That's something that's structured, and people have accepted that as a good thing for us, for example. And then for example, in the bilingual education program, students were tested in terms of whether they were learning enough English or not. And depending on that, then the practice was to place them into programs, excuse me, into classrooms that, for example, would be remedial or offer more English instruction. So again, this is a practice that we know in education is not a good practice to have, but yet as we most people understand that practice as just the way schools are. So changing those type of policies and those type of practices is very different because people just accept them as the way that it has to be.
Two things before I'm doing this right now. Where can people get uh, How Schools Make Race, which you have right back there? Where can
Mhm.
I get it? And what's your website? I've been to your website a whole bunch of times.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Thanks for asking. So the book is available in all major booksellers, including Barnes& and Noble, Bookshop, also the press, Harvard Education Press. And I would also ask your listeners to please ask your local library and your bookstore to please carry the book.
Okay. Um, can you talk about the difference between, I always get confused, racial identity and racialization,
Yeah.
and why that difference matters in the classroom?
Thank you. Yeah. So this is interesting because a lot of research and a lot of ways people think about race are in terms of identity. Like I'm this race, or et cetera, and as if that's just part of their identity, which is part of it. But my book isn't looking at, for example, how people understand their own racial identity. So in education, for example, and other research, I'm not looking at the racial identity development. I'm not looking at that in terms of how students become Latinx or become white or become African American. That's not what I'm doing. What I mean by racialization is in a way, I'm thinking more at the group level and seeing how one group is delineated against another group. So this group exists because it's different from this other group. So I'm looking at the boundaries of the group itself, not the individual people.
Okay, moving on. There's so much here that I'm trying to I've got some great notes here, the things that I wanted to talk to you
Sure.
about. Um,
Thank you.
what patterns did you notice in how educators talk about or avoid talking about race and Latinx identity?
Yeah, thanks. So one of the things that I noticed is, well, something that was very surprising to me, I could say, is that when I first started the study, I thought that I wasn't really going to see any teaching that was about race. And surprisingly, even from the beginning of my study, I started noticing that teachers were directly addressing the topic about race and racism. So that was very surprising to me. And one of the things that I noticed, being more and more in the classroom, was that teachers were also very aware of having students understand that the Latinx group was very diverse in terms of the cultural practices, the way that they spoke Spanish or even other languages, obviously, and different aspects in terms of how the group is not just all the same, and especially not all Mexican, which a lot of the times is confused with just what is Latinx. So the teachers were very conscious of having their students understand this. And the students also expressed to me that they appreciated this, they understood this. So that was actually something wonderful to see in the classrooms also. And it was also great to see the teachers expand the idea of what the students imagined even Latinx look like. What does a Latino look like, for example? So teachers brought up lessons that had to do with expanding these images. For example, one teacher taught students that there was in Mexico there was migration from China. So students were very amazed that there's actually people who are Chinese Mexican in
Wow.
Mexico. So the students were very interested and they were in this disbelief actually. But this I talk about in the book in terms of expanding the idea of what the students imagined was the stereotype of what a Latinx looks like.
Okay. Okay. I just want to go off topic. One quick, I love this question. I borrowed it from one of my favorite journalists. Here goes. Excluding family or friends, somebody living or dead you'd like to spend a day with.
Oh, that's difficult. I'm a big fan of Noam Chomsky. I'm not sure spending a whole day. I would love that. I don't know if Noam Chomsky would, but
Mm.
that would be someone that comes to mind.
Great, great answer. Quite a mind. And
Yeah,
I think he's still rolling along in his 90s there. Um,
yeah, yeah.
yes. All
Mhm.
right, great answer. Okay, moving along. Um, I like this question. How do well-meaning teachers uh, contribute to racialization without even realizing it?
Um, I think that teachers sometimes, without realizing it, it's because they contribute to it by, for example, not teaching about race. One of the big lessons in the book is that the question is not really should schools or should teachers teach about race. The question is really how are they doing it and how can they do it better? So one of the things that I show in the book is that regardless of whether teachers were teaching about race directly or indirectly, race comes up in the classroom. Students are asking questions about it. They're very interested in it. And and in order to understand society in a truthful way, we also have to understand that it is racialized, how it's racialized, how it functions. So in order for teachers to be able to address these type of questions, they have to make sure that they are head on talking about these issues.
Okay. Um,
And Calvin, may I add, since I know you're a journalist,
Absolutely.
I thought of two journalists that I would like to spend the day with.
Oh, yes.
So one of them would be Juan Gonzalez, and the other one would be Maria Hinojosa.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Yes.
It's a great question. By the way,
Yeah.
it's a wonderful question.
Yes. Okay.
Truthfully, I borrowed it from Barbara Walters, who was one of my favorite journalists, and it's just very provocative, and it kind of makes you think, and it's that's great. Um, what would you say to educators who think they are colorblind in the classroom?
Yeah, like I said before, I think one of the steps is to recognize that our society has a lot of history and current problems in terms of racial issues. So the book is speaking to teachers who understand that race exists and that racism is something that we need to correct in our society. So the book is speaking more to those type of folks who have an idea about who have those ideas and but really want to understand race in a deeper way than just a multicultural way of, for example, like, oh, your racial identity is good, and then just be nice to others. That type of like superficial understanding of race is what I'm trying to expand on, so that teachers and others understand race in a deeper way.
Okay. How can we'll get this the last topic in this little grouping, but how can teachers begin to recognize their role in shaping racial meaning? Even sometimes when they don't like intend to, they still shape it.
Yes, thank you. I think one of the things that teachers would find helpful in order to do that is to work with other teachers who are also committed to this type of work and who are committed to exploring in their own practice. Because being a community with others, one is able to receive feedback that may be difficult. Talking about race is a difficult thing. Um, so being in community with others who are also invested and committed in doing this, and also perhaps having type of coaches, professional development, in order to also be able to see blind spots, because everyone has blind spots. So being in community with others to grow and to be able to identify those would be helpful.
Okay. Um, how can bilingual education reconnect with what you described in here as race radical roots, and what role does justice play in the reconnection?
Thank you. Yeah. So bilingual education has a long history in the US. And one of the things that happened in the Chicano movement, for example, students and other folks were calling for bilingual education because they saw it as a way for them to be able to preserve languages, for to have teachers who would be affirming of their language and cultures, etc. So that's definitely something that is needed in schools. The thing is that sometimes bilingual education has moved on, or not moved on, but sometimes deviated from that and just focusing just on language for language sake. And what I pose in the book is that bilingual education and ethnic studies have to be merged so that they are speaking to each other and providing an education that, yes, is linguistically and culturally relevant for students and affirming, but that it also provides students with opportunities that enhance their critical consciousness about our society.
Okay, okay. I mentioned to you before we started. A few weeks ago, I was interviewing 40 actors and actresses for the Clark State Film Festival, and it was a kind of an easy prep. But you're not an easy prep. I had to really dive into a lot of stuff that I'm not necessarily familiar with, so I had to learn, which is great. You kind of moved me along. But I read your interview in EdSurge. And it was a nice interview, and I actually pulled out something if you wanted to comment on that. But it was surprising. I'm just going to read from my notes here. It was surprising to read that the test for native Spanish speakers to prove their English fluency was more difficult than the test for English speakers to prove their Spanish fluency, and that the students who were native Spanish speakers didn't have as good academic outcomes as those who entered the program as English speakers. So there's this dichotomy, isn't there?
Yeah, maybe I misheard you, but let me share that the teachers perceived the test that was in Spanish as difficult for everyone.
Okay.
So it was more difficult for everyone.
It was okay.
And then for example, the English test would be for example, the English speakers, the English native speakers. That was the distinction. So
Okay.
so the hurdle in terms of just the way that the two tests were designed, the Spanish test, the teachers felt was more hard than the English test, which meant that then the students who were Spanish dominant you would imagine that they would have an advantage, but that was not necessarily the case because
Okay.
of the way that the test was designed.
So
So,
does that all fall under the umbrella of race, even when they're constructing that?
well, it's interesting because yes, and it's interesting because who are the ones who are Spanish dominant in our society? Those are the Latinx group. That's the Latinx students. So yes.
Yeah.
And then you had a second question, but I don't remember what that one was about. I think it had to do with the seal of biliteracy, like the seal on their diploma in terms of like um, labeling which student was officially like biliterate.
Well, the
That
second part was, students who were native Spanish speakers didn't have as good academic outcomes as those who entered the program as English speakers. I mean, it's just something I extract. I just, when I read these things, it's that four-letter word that just pounds away at my sensibilities. Race.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
race.
yeah.
Um, all right, moving along. Uh, we're doing good, by the way. No, we're doing really, we're just kind of moving along because there's a lot here. Um, what surprised you most when you were doing your field work and your interviews for how schools make race?
Yeah, like I said before, what surprised me was that I had imagined that I wasn't going to see any really lessons or not that many lessons that had to do with race, but that was not the case. The teachers were very committed. Not all of them, but many of them were very committed to teaching about race and racism.
Okay. Um, what would you like policymakers or school administrators to take away from how schools make race?
Sure. I would like for policymakers, administrators to see this as a call to support teachers in the difficult work of teaching about race and to lobby for providing material for teachers who are teaching in Spanish also to be able to bring in ideas about race that are critical, for example, for students to learn, because the teachers were also very exhausted from having to do that type of looking for the resources that they needed in order to bring up those type of issues in the Spanish language, which was needed in the program.
Okay, so I asked that question, and what do you help readers, especially educators, will do after they read your book?
Well, I hope educators also recommend the book to other educators. I would like for educators to see some of the practices that the teachers did, for example, that I described, and then think about their own practice and their own students, and then see about how they could also teach about race in ways that complicates it more versus just thinking about it in this multicultural way that I describe in the book. And what I describe in the book is that I was observing a middle school and a high school, and the bilingual program had the students from elementary. So in the elementary level, students were learning about race in terms of it was about skin color, and they learned that students obviously should not be mean to others based on how they look, that they should be inclusive, etc., which are all wonderful lessons to learn, obviously, that they are very, very needed lessons. The issue is that those were the same type of lessons in terms of racism as about being mean to others, etc., or race is about skin color, etc. And those type of ideas were not really being progressed throughout their years. So by the time they were in high school, some of them were not as engaged in terms of they were bored with some of the lessons that they
Uh-huh,
felt were repetitive.
uh-huh. Um, how do you see your work fitting into the larger movement for racial justice in education?
I think that one of the things that the book provides that perhaps other books have not is really deep descriptions about what's going on in these classrooms. It's also thinking about the Latinx group as a racialized group. A lot of times people think about it as an ethnicity. And I, in the book, directly address this. And I say that, yes, it could be an ethnicity, for example, like any other group. What I'm concerned about is when people say that it is not a racialized group. And I say that it is a racialized group because of it having a history and currently also experiencing racism, and that racism actually creating the type of experiences needed in order for a group to form. So what I share in the book is that race is not really about skin color. It's not really about this identity that you share with others. It's actually experiencing racism.
Okay, nicely put. Last question, to kind of wrap this up. And by the way, we did good. We did really good here. We did the essence. Are you working up any? Are you working on any follow-up projects, or exploring other dimensions of race and schooling?
Yes, I am working on other projects that are very researchy in the sense of like theorizing different things. And I won't describe those. I'm also thinking about how teachers, the study that I did for the book had teachers who identified in different racial categories. My next study is looking at teachers who specifically identify as Latinx teachers. So
Uh,
how do they understand their own work in the classroom, for example?
which is hugely important to get right to the soul of a teacher. Uh, so needed, for my layman's, definitely needed. All right, last, just remind people where they can get How Schools Make Race.
Yes, thank you. Listeners can get it at any major bookseller, for example, Bookshop, Barnes and Noble, and the Harvard Education Press website. And I would also ask readers if they could ask their public library or their local bookstore to purchase the book.
Perfect. Well, you know what? We sort of kind of did it all here, and within our little time constraints. And so I'm officially welcoming you to come back.
Thank you.
Listen, we could do panels. I sit in this chair 12 hours a day. I wear out the arms of my chairs. And I'm so eager to explore, especially all these things about race, because I came out of the 60s, and I'm looking, and I drew this. I'm looking, I drew this as an expression of what I felt like dealing with race and civil rights and all these things. So I drew that in 1970. So this stuff is very near and dear to me. And so please come back. And I can't thank you enough, Laura, for your
Oh,
time.
thank you. I appreciate it. Questions
Yeah,
were wonderful. Thank you
yeah.
so
And I'm
much.
just going to stop recording. Don't leave. I would do a 30-second wrap up. I really thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
Very illuminating. Thank you.